human intelligence works in sort of the opposite way, which is like if I showed you one picture of like a woolly mammoth, and that's the only picture of a woolly mammoth you had ever seen, right? And then you came across one in the world, but now it's like half the size that you expected and red. You wouldn't be like, what the fuck is this thing? I have no clue what to do with this.
Butterscotch.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 398 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast, Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam and I'm the tools programmer.
I'm Sam and I'm the artiste.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today's January 13th, Friday the 13th, in fact.
It's very spooky.
Also,
Friday
happy birthday, Mom. You know?
Happy birthday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Doxed.
Yep.
Doxed. You can look it up on Facebook, too.
Get doxed, Mom.
Get doxed.
As a birthday gift from us to you. Today's January 13th, 20 Jubilee. Before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be profanity on this show and lots of doxing now.
Oh, yeah.
So we're expanding our scope of coverage.
We're going to look at the calendar and we're going to tell you everyone's birthdays.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Everyone's.
We'd also like to thank our supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. Thank you so much for your recurring donations to keep our microphones filled with nutrients. I've got like a little Pez dispenser on my microphone that just kind of zips sugar pills into my mouth every now and then. And without these recurring donations, I couldn't keep that thing stocked.
Get me
honestly.
one of those. We currently are not, donations coming in are not enough for us each.
We can't get it for
those.
all three of our microphones.
So
but
if y'all could
I've
just
got
juice
one.
that a bit. Yeah. I would like to spring for the propane powered one though that just like shoots it
Like a shotgun.
like a shotgun into the back of my throat.
Would this be a double-barreled Pez dispenser situation?
No, it's like a 6-shooter, so actually no. Like the spinning, the spinning Gatling gun things from movies, which I don't think anything works like that in real life, right? Where it like spins at a jillion
I don't know.
RPMs.
I think there is a real
think some
thing
do.
like that.
Maybe that's how there's like big
I thought like on helicopters and
like
stuff, they have
A-10s and
stuff
shit.
like that.
Yeah.
maybe that's what that is.
Yeah, because I think it's that when you're firing that fast, you need to rotate through additional barrels so that the barrels don't overheat. Because if you fire that many bullets through the same barrel,
It just
it gets
melts.
red hot and then warps.
barrel
So you actually
melts.
use the spinning airflow to cool down the barrel before it comes back around the next time.
Right. It's probably better
it's
to
a
have a
cooling
whole
system.
bunch than just have one because it would like wobble a lot if you just had one barrel that had to kind of swing around really fast.
I don't know how that works as far as the timing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's probably not timed. It's probably
some
mechanically
mechanical thing, yeah.
constrained by some kind of gear.
Oh, I mean, it
thing,
definitely
right?
is. But like,
Every time I see those fucking mechanical contraptions that people came up with in like the 1800s, and like they came up with some way of sticking a whole bunch of shit together to achieve something that can like move in a certain way, and I'm like trying to reason through how it's working,
And they didn't have
can't.
computers. They just like
they
they just like drew it. They just drew it on a piece of paper, and they're like, "I think that'll work."
I don't know. I went to I think it was maybe a naval museum or something. I can't remember exactly where, but it was a museum where they had some of these old cannons and stuff on display. And like the amount of, it's the same thing where like the number of variations in kind of cannon. There was one that had like 10 barrels on it. It was arranged in like a giant cone. It was literally like a 10-barreled cannon so that you could load it all up at once and then sort of fire it kind of sequentially or even like all in like a big salvo sort of thing. There's a bunch of these really weird ones where it's sort of like that thing where it's like, well, one cannon barrel's good.
Yeah.
What if we put 10 of them together? It's like, it's kind of awesome.
Yeah, the amount of effort and technology we put into murder is really quite astounding. Lots of great innovations, great minds, really advancing progress. All right, now we got a couple of things to talk about today before we go into. We're gonna try to get to some questions as well. So I got a little story about kind of a funny World of Warcraft, not necessarily Easter egg, but kind of like discovery that happened, which is pretty hilarious. And we'll talk a little bit about some AI stuff, because it's just kind of endlessly fascinating. All right, so this World of Warcraft Easter egg thing. Okay, I'm like, I set the stage here. So in this game, you can get pieces of equipment that make your character stronger. One of those kinds of equipment is called a trinket. It's basically just like a little like thing that you can equip. It's not like a weapon or gloves or whatever. It's just a arbitrary kind of an object.
It's like a charm, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Grants you something.
And trinkets are always highly sought after because they always have strange effects. They're never just like this trinket just like has strength on it. It's always like this trinket like shoots lightning onto stuff whenever you get hit by something or just weird shit like that. So the new expansion has been out for a while, and there's all these new trinkets because there's always new trinkets whenever new content comes out, and people are always trying to figure out what are the best trinkets, what are the good trinkets, and people get really obsessive about these trinkets because they oftentimes have very unique and interesting effects that sometimes work really well with some things that your character can do.
So
right?
they basically have some synergies that you can theoretically discover or even take advantage of in a big way to do some ridiculous stuff. Okay, got it.
Yeah, so depending on what your character can do, some trinkets are like a big deal, and so everybody's going crazy about these trinkets, running like building sims and like simming all the different trinkets for their character and which one is best, and like going and trying to get the one, And meanwhile, I don't really give a fuck about this kind of stuff because I'm like, whatever I get is whatever I get, and I'll just do the best I can. So there's this one trinket that I've been using this whole time called the ruby whelp shell, and it's a little egg, okay? And all that happens with this egg is every now and then a little baby dragon shows up and just, quote, helps you in combat. And it just kind of does some stuff. Like it'll like give you some stats, or maybe it'll like shoot a little fireball on somebody, or maybe it'll heal one of your teammates. It just kind of does some stuff. Okay. Everybody has been talking shit about this ruby whelp shell trinket because they're like, this thing's a piece of shit. Dragon just shows up and does nothing, hardly anything at all. Right.
And I've been running what it's going to do. Right. It's just some random.
And I've been using this trinket. And I've been competitive with it with everybody who's like going after all these hardcore crazy trinkets that they think are a big deal. Okay. So it turns out that the ruby whelp shell. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention, there's one extra thing you can do with the ruby whelp shell, which is a bizarre thing, which is it has a cryptic ability that you can use with it that has a 1-day cooldown. And the ability says to just like summon your ruby whelpling and like show it the world or something like that.
Oh, so it's like a little buddy you can.
So is this? Yeah. I mean, this sounds like a Pokemon evolution scenario.
Yeah. Well, so what it turns out is that 1-day cooldown, if you target specific things in the world and summon your little dragon and show it something, then that basically trains it up in a way to like be better at some aspect of what it is that it does. And so I just like unknowingly have been using this trinket, and whenever the 1-day cooldown was up, and when I happened to notice, I would just like summon my dragon, or whatever.
Just show it something.
And it'd just be like, look at this thing. And then it would have a little emote, or it'd be like, oh, your dragon like does a little dance, or oh, your dragon like shoots out a little puff of fire.
Clementine will remember that sort of.
Yeah. And I was like, I've just been using it because it's like dumb and fun.
Adorable, yeah.
But it turns out that this trinket, like once you train this dragon up, is like the best trinket in the game, and everybody has been just ignoring it. And like so many of the people in my guild have disenchanted it, so they've gotten it and then they just destroyed it. Or they got it and then they just sold it to a vendor because they're like, this is just a piece of crap. It's just taking up bag space, And so somebody figured all this stuff out. And like how the training system works and whatever, because it's all kind of like very obfuscated on purpose, And now all of a sudden, everybody's like opening up tickets, support tickets to like try to get their trinkets restored that they destroyed, and all this stuff. And I think it's just a good lesson, right? Because like if you're getting like hyper obsessed with like all the min maxing and trying to like squeeze that extra little last percentage and following what everybody else says is the best, then probably you may end up missing some stuff, right? And also like, so what? It's a video game.
I think it's also it's a difference between like continuing to climb up a slope of improvement rather than leaping to a new peak, right?
Looking around.
Yeah, it's the same as like this is how stochastic models work for solving certain kinds of problems where like if you to solve it just kind of randomly, the solution space is it's basically infinite, right? So you can't actually explore the full space and then say, oh, this part of the space is actually the best one. Therefore, like this is the model we want to use, right? When things get really complicated, you just have to explore random parts of this infinitely large space, right? Because and then as you explore random parts, you're gonna like be landing at like very different places, you know, like with different possibilities of how high the peaks can go or how low they'll go or whatever, right? But being on one of those peaks doesn't give you any information about another one. And so,
yeah, you're doing the best that you can with what you're exactly looking at.
Yeah, and
which is a local maxima.
Yep. So a lot of like the way that these models work is they have to they do two things. One is when they find something that is better, like the score goes up, right? But the score never gets like because it usually is a scoring mechanism. The highest score wins, kind of a deal for like trying to choose the right model, right? But it always has to be a combo of there's an added extra random chance that even when things are going well, you also try something really different sometimes, right? Just to try to land on another peak that's actually a better place to be. Yeah. And it's
so
yeah, that's the best way to define these things.
This is a great segue into this AI stuff.
That is good.
Because all right, so AI is everywhere. We've talked about it quite a few times. We have some interesting stories about our own sort of like playing around with AI or like around the winter break and stuff. I've been trying to listen to a lot of people talking about like both sides of the debate about what AI is capable of and where it's going, right? Because you got some people who are almost like the crypto bros of AI, right? Where they're just like, this is what we are doing is the next big thing. And you got other people which are basically saying like, yeah, but like, let's think about this, you know? Mm-hmm. And also maybe the way that we're going about it isn't actually going to get us there. And so Adam, when you're talking about this idea of the local maxima, I was listening to the Ezra Klein show, and he's had several guests talking about AI. And one of the analogies that they used was the idea of the drunk person looking for their keys at night. I don't know if you've heard this analogy, which is like there's this drunk guy, he's lost his keys, and he just keeps like looking around in this like streetlight area. Like there's this illuminated area on the sidewalk, and he just keeps like walking in circles trying to find his keys, you know? And then this police officer comes in and sees this guy, like he's clearly distraught, and he's like just walking in circles, you know? And the police officer's like, "Sir, what are you doing?" And the guy's like, "Oh, I'm trying to find my keys." And the officer's like, "I've noticed that you've only been looking in this one spot this whole time. Have you tried looking other places?" And the guy is like, "Well, I can't look anywhere else because this is where the street light is." Right? And it's like, so this guy talking about AI was talking about how right now deep learning or machine learning is the street light. And we're trying to solve a bunch of problems of creating intelligence with AI, but we're only looking in one specific spot and trying to use that basically and just scaling it up, right? It's basically like if we just give it more and more and more data, then it'll just be able to keep doing more and more things, when really it's just going to be doing the same things, but just with a bigger data set, right?
I think that metaphor also works really well just for the much simpler problem of just data analysis, interpreting data, like how people do it, right? Because the whole idea of like a machine learning system is that it's building up something so complicated that a person actually can't really understand what it's even doing, right? They can understand the algorithms that have been put together to make it do that, but the final thing that it's doing is not actually like meaningfully comprehensible, right? But even with just like a simple data analysis thing where you just have a pool of numbers and you're like, I don't know how this thing works, right? It's the idea that I'm always talking about of having bad data is not better than having no data for exactly this metaphorical reason, right? Because when people say like, oh, well, this is like the best we can get, this is like the data we have, so this is like, and like we can get this interpretation out of it, and sure, yeah, it's got all these caveats, right? But because it's what we have, we're gonna make decisions based on this, right? It's the same metaphorically. It's basically saying like, well, that's where the spotlight is, right? So we're just gonna hang out in this space because now it's not about whether or not the interpretation is useful or correct or anything. It's just literally, well, this is where the spotlight is.
Yeah, and I think a good kind of like a good kind of way of thinking about where we're at with this kind of AI stuff is that if you think about a human brain, the human brain has a a lot of different parts that are responsible for different kinds of things, but they also kind of like shift the responsibility around at different times in kind of like strange ways. Like, and there's not necessarily
a lot. Basically.
Yeah, there's a lot of crosstalk. There's a lot of like offloading of resources and demands from one part of the brain to the other. And so, I think for the longest time, there's this idea that like, oh, like there's this section of the brain that's like for this thing, and this other section of the brain that's just for this thing, right? When really it's way more complicated than that. Like there are areas of the brain that are predominantly in use for certain kinds of activities, but they're still pulling from lots of other places, right? And so you'll see really bizarre things happen, like if somebody gets some kind of a brain injury where like a piece of their brain ends up missing, right? And there will be some things that they can no longer do, but not always forever, right? And like sometimes things kind of shift around and the brain kind of like adapts and shifts resources to make it so that they can still get by, right? So it's kind of like a self-adapting thing. But what that implies is that it's not like our brain is just like one big blob that just does things in one way, right? Which is what deep learning is. It's like what we're basically developing with deep learning is some kind of prediction and pattern matching system, but it doesn't actually have any other capabilities beyond that on its own. And so probably what's going to have to happen in the longer term is that we'll have to take this thing, this deep learning concept, and start to use that as a piece of the AI brain, right? And then make some other thing that can talk to the deep learning module and build understanding out of it, right? Because until you have that, all you have is like, what did you call it, Sam? A stochastic parrot, like a dumb thing that just kind of like
research. Some of the researchers that I was looking at were talking about, when you talk about AI, I think basically calling it AI is useful from essentially like just an immediate grokability standpoint from people, which is like what the thing is capable of doing, which is producing things that appear to be intelligent or are coherent, right?
Well, that's what I would say the A is for, because like I would say it's not intelligence. It's artificial intelligence, which is it has the appearance of intelligence, but it's really just a pattern matching model.
Yeah, and that can be really confusing because, again, the patterns that we're talking about here are, to Adam's point earlier, about just the size of the data set involved here and like what you're looking at from like just how big that basically a streetlight gets. It is weird to say that, that this thing could produce, using basically this like pattern matching stuff, could essentially produce like an essay that is coherent, right? And it seems to make a lot of sense. It seems weird to say that that's just like a pattern matching activity and that behind that, nothing is understood about what is being stated. Or in the case of these pictures that a lot of people were talking about AI art generation stuff. And I think one of the funniest things to me is its inability to understand what a hand is. Because
it doesn't understand anything.
Well, but I think that's what I'm saying. Is like I think if you look at how it produces hands, it's a really good example of how this kind of a model it's not producing things by knowing what it's doing. It's producing things by essentially statistically trying to kind of like push things, morph things in the direction of coherence, right? And so there's a big difference.
But it's not trying to render a hand.
Correct, because it's true that when you
it doesn't know what a hand is.
Exactly. So when you look at a human being trying to draw a hand, it is very rare for a person to give it 6, 8 fingers or another hand coming out of a finger. Or like, just all sorts of weird shit like that, right?
Hands are notoriously hard even for people to draw. Like, but that means from a realistic perspective, but it's still going to have its 5 fingers, right?
That's
Unless you're doing cartoons, and it might have fewer in cartoons because
for a reason,
which is just a lot of skinny fingers is not actually very good for animation and stuff, right?
And the black outlines around cartoon fingers kind of crowd out this fine detail of having fewer fingers.
So I think if you think about it from the hand standpoint, that's a really good. I think it's a visual metaphor for the actual capabilities this thing has, which is that it can produce things that appear to have coherence, but are oftentimes wrong when you know how many fingers a hand is supposed to have, right? When you know what you're actually looking for, when you have some expertise in that domain, it's very rapidly apparent sometimes that the model, because it's stochastic, and stochastic is a fancy word, just essentially means random. Is that right, Adam?
Yeah, basically.
Random. Yeah. It's a random model, so it's doing stuff.
It's a math word for, and remember, randomness actually isn't a real the idea of randomness is a lot more subtle than people, because people think it means like when people say like literally random, they just mean like absolutely anything can happen kind of a thing, right? But randomness just means there's some degree of unpredictability as to which of some set of outcomes are possible, right? But like something that's 90% likely to occur is still random. Something that's 99% likely to occur, still random, right? It's just, so randomness itself doesn't mean anything inherently. It's about the degree of different kinds of outcomes and how you decide what they are. This is the whole idea of like, oh, the universe would be predictable if you could know, where literally everything, if you had literally all of the information, you could predict all kinds of stuff, right? With very high certainty. And it's like, okay, that's true. But that's not possible, right? And that gets to the idea of like randomness isn't inherent in the thing. It's about your ability to predict it. And so randomness is actually a limitation of the observer, right? Not the thing itself. But yeah, when it comes to like these models, like the stochastic aspect basically says it can't just take what's out there and then give it back to you, because then we would say, oh, this is just copy.
That's just copyright infringement.
It has to give you something else. And the only way it can do it is by trying to understand and model things as basically a random system. But again, random in the idea of there being some degree of unpredictability. So like faces are random, right? But extremely biased random, right? Most faces have 2 eyes and a nose and 2 ears, right? Most faces have hair on the top of their heads, right? And like there's these, so it's a biased randomness. And basically what these models are doing is they're basically given fuckloads of data, right? And they're trying to pull out those patterns that are still random as far as it's concerned, right? Because it doesn't, again, like I said, doesn't know what it's looking at, right? But it can discover the concept of a face, because there are so many faces and the variation between faces is not so high that it can't find a pattern there, right? Unlike a hand, because a hand can be, think of how many configurations a single hand can be in, right? Your fingers can be fucking anywhere, and like the angle towards
all
the
the
camera,
different perspectives, and
different perspectives and all this kind of stuff, right? It's actually, you can take to successfully capture the concept of a hand, right? Means that you have to have a model that's enormous that captures so many hands and all their different variations that like that you can represent them, but also that model has to somehow be able to see, even though, like, if you take a hand and turn it sideways and look at it, right?
It just
doesn't look like a fucking hand anymore. Yeah, exactly. So that's actually why this thing is so hard, is because the model actually can't see both of those things as a hand, right?
Yeah, I put it this way: the possibility space for a hand, the same reason it's hard to draw, it's so big, so fucking big. Yeah, and so this idea of stochastic parroting instead of artificial intelligence was in one of the articles I was reading about from some of the AI researchers. But basically, what they're saying is that it's intelligence in a lot of the same ways that you see intelligence from parrots, where they're repeating things, and sometimes they repeat things and smash them together, but it's kind of all the same stuff that it's been given before.
But the parrot it's not trying to say something about it. It's just repeating things.
Because even like an infant baby artist trying to draw a hand will get the number of fingers correct. They'll get the number of limbs correct on a person. There's no confusion about what you're actually trying to draw, because you're actually trying to, what you're trying to draw. It's not trying to somehow.
It's a skill problem of drawing, less so than an understanding of what a hand is.
Exactly. And so in the case of these AI, then you have this situation where the broader the possibility space for a particular thing, the more apparent it is that it has no idea what it is actually drawing or what it is actually sort of putting together at all.
Well, and I think the idea that the model that you get doesn't actually, like, within the model, there isn't a thing that you would then say, oh, that's its understanding of a hand, right?
Correct.
You might find that for a face, because there are enough very overlapping patterns of faces that you end up actually with like one model that kind of represents how to generate a face, right? But because hands can then be represented in so many basically discrete, you can think of just different peaks, right? Like a sideways hand versus a high five versus a fist, right? It's actually like 3 separate models, right? That
very different things
that we can tell as people, like, that those are all representations of the concept of a hand, right? But they're actually just 3 completely different concepts in the context of like a.
Well, I'd also think about it from a perspective problem of like, if you're training up an AI on faces, are you going to show it faces from the the top down? Are you going to show it like, what is it? What
Really
is
weird angles?
yeah, like really weird angles. And it's like, no, you're just going to show it like people generally looking kind of towards the camera, right?
Yep.
But that's not true of hands or most other body parts, which can be at the ends of limbs, and they're in all kinds of
Oh
different
yeah, they can be anywhere in
configurations.
space. Yeah, it's just
So I would bet, you know, if you wanted it to draw a top-down view of someone, it would the face part of it would not necessarily be accurate. Yeah, and it's because the deep learning in like machine learning concept is all about taking a huge amount of data about like a thing, right? And then as soon as you come across something that isn't already in your data set, then you can't infer a connection to it, right? Whereas like as a human intelligence works in sort of the opposite way, which is like if I showed you one picture of like a woolly mammoth, and that's the only picture of a woolly mammoth you had ever seen, right? And then you came across one in the world, but now it's like half the size that you expected and red. You wouldn't be like, what the fuck is this thing? I have
be like,
no
that looks like a red woolly mammoth. Why is it so tiny?
Yeah, you wouldn't be like, I have no clue what to do with this, right? And which is why things like self-driving cars are a big problem, right? Because if you're training like a car to recognize a pedestrian and like an animal, you know, blah blah blah. And like, what happens if let's say somebody's driving an excavator across the road, and just by chance, this machine learning pattern recognition thing in this car was not trained up on what a piece of construction equipment looks like, or that piece of construction equipment. And it can't really infer it, right? And so it doesn't know if that thing is an obstruction or a hazard or something to just completely stop for or just drive around. Maybe it's just a garbage truck that it just needs to, it's just like stopped and it can go around and that's fine. There's a lot of like of inference coming from past experience that just gets applied to new unfamiliar things that machine learning cannot do.
Well, I think a lot of it is
right?
like the kind of models that we use were like the kind of, because it is in the end still, pattern recognition, right? But it's it's
pattern recognition plus extrapolation, right?
Yeah. So that means that the kind of models that we store then aren't like, here's the model for how to generate a dog, right? It's somehow actually simpler than that, right? It's not like, here are all the components that make up a dog or whatever, right? It's here's this like really, really abstract idea of a dog-shaped entity of it, and that first gives you the idea of an entity. Right? Yeah, you start getting all this, yeah, because our brain, and it's actually like
a perfect model of a chair.
Yeah, but it's a hierarchical model, right? Where it's like even the concept of an object, as in like sort of the upstream, most abstract concept of like an object is a thing that can be in the world, whether it's a person or a desk or whatever, right?
A discrete
thing. Because we start from there with the idea that there are like things out in the world that take up space and volume, right? And that they are discrete from one another, right? Because even that's actually not real.
You actually don't start there, right? Because babies take a while to even get object.
Yeah, to figure that out. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So you actually start a place where you're like, everything's soup, and I don't even know what the fuck is going on.
You start kind of like one with the universe, in sort of a Zen monk state.
Yeah, but you end up building though these like all these different models that you can then add on top of each other and like mix together and do all this kind of stuff with, right? So that you're not basically taking a data set and asking like, which of my models does this apply, right? Or you're not saying like, oh, which of my models should I use to like answer this question or generate this information or whatever, right? It's instead like constantly mixing and remixing at different layers of abstraction to figure out how. So it's basically, you can imagine like trial fitting like Tetris. It's like you're taking all these patterns and being like, which one of these combinations at the right level of hierarchy, right? Like then tell me, oh, that's a window. Right. And that's not what machine learning is
happening here. Yeah. So I think it's the case that then the reason I think it's important to, and this isn't to say that this stuff isn't powerful or useful in a wide variety of contexts, because it is this particular kind of I don't know what you call it, intelligence or thinking, right? But it is the case that I think you recognizing where it has limitations and more importantly, why those limitations are in there, I think can give you as a person a bit more understanding of like where these things will fall short and where they sort of will have a very hard time until again, it's on a different kind of a model entirely as far as how it thinks, right? Because while you could still say, I don't know, someone may already have like try to train up an AI on hands, because people have been training up AIs and all sorts of stuff recently, right? So maybe someone has trained up a hand model AI, and then like it knows it can like really get pretty good at putting hands together, right?
Well, honestly, and that makes sense, right? That like you would have, it's like we talked about the brain having different parts like good at different things, right? Like a significant amount of our brain power is dedicated to just being able to recognize human faces.
There's a part of your brain, like a whole piece.
That's a specific thing that we have.
Yeah.
That we're
Just
very good
for pattern
at.
recognition.
And also that you can be bad at and also have a brain lesion that causes you to be unable to do, like there are people who have the literal inability to differentiate faces from each other, right?
Yeah. And so like
facial
basically,
fusiform area, I think is what it's called.
Yeah, whatever it is.
yeah. So like what we're doing with AI then is in the long term, we're actually just building independent pieces of a brain, right? So like the basic pattern recognition and pattern matching thing turns out hands are weird, right? But also it's about standards because like if you are an animal and you rarely see a human hand, then you may not really care to distinguish between what the individual fingers are doing or whatever, right? But if you're a human and you have hands and everybody around you has hands, and recognizing all the nuanced motions and positioning of hands is really important for you to navigate, right? Then having a piece of your brain that's really good at that is really important, right? And so somebody's going to develop some plugin for just hand pattern recognition that like a deep learning image generation system could use, and it like the hand generation part would fill in that gap, right? Same thing with faces, same thing with whatever. And so over time, you can kind of like assemble these together and make a digital brain that can.
They already have. There's already libraries of these that you can add into. I was looking at this when I was doing some experiments with Stable Diffusion. Like you can get ones that are trained on. You basically can get these big data set add-on things that someone has put together that say like do a bunch of anime or a bunch of like anime faces or whatever else. So you can actually pull these into the basic model that they have and start getting stuff that's much more accurate for the particular kind of thing you're looking at. But again, when it generates
not going outside those bounds,
it does not know what it is, what things are, and it's a weird point that feels like maybe it's splitting hairs. But I think if you
it's not splitting hairs because this is the framing that one of these AI researchers on the Ezra Klein show used was they're talking about this in relation to the concept of bullshit.
Yes.
They basically said so. There's three kinds of information. There's truth, there's lies, and there's bullshit. Right. So truth is like there's things that are reflected in reality. Right. And there's lies, which lying is about intent, where it's like what's true and you purposely obscure the information. And bullshit is just some stuff that has no intentional relationship with facts, right? Mm-hmm. It's just saying some things without any concern or understanding about whether it relates to reality, right?
It's probably a better way to think about what they're capable of generating at this point.
Yeah. And so the problem is like where we're at right now with machine learning is we have now just suddenly found ourselves surrounded with infinite bullshit generators. Because think about like what happened in 2016 with the Russian like troll farm concept, where they were just like, let's just pay a bunch of people, like $1 million a month or whatever, and we can just overwhelm social media with just bullshit. Not bots, but just people spewing bullshit. And some of that bullshit will get caught on and start to be interpreted as true by people. And otherwise, it just kind of floods the system and makes it hard to tell truth from fiction. Well, now guess what? You don't have to pay people to do that anymore. You got AI that can do it. And it doesn't have any opinions about whether what it is saying is harmful or helpful or accurate or inaccurate. It's just going to say stuff, right? And so you can flood any system you want, whether it's with images or with things that look like official news articles.
Yeah.
Like I was kind of blown away. I was using the Chat GPT to see like what is this thing's level of capacity to kind of like extrapolate even from within this conversation that I'm having with it. And so I started asking it about just simple stuff like unit conversions, where I was just like, what's the distance, from the Earth to the moon? And then it gave me a number. Right. And I'm like, I'm not gonna fact check it. I'm just gonna assume that that's correct and like keep asking it some questions. And then I was like, what's the length of a Chevy Cavalier? And it was like, oh, it's like something feet. And then I was just like, how many Chevy Cavaliers would it take end to end to reach the moon? And its number was just completely wrong based on the two numbers that it had
'Cause
given.
again,
It gave you a number though.
It gave you
It
a
just
confidence.
it just said it.
Yeah.
It just said this is how much it would take.
That's what I mean. It's like it does not know
It doesn't know
what
anything.
it is talking about. It doesn't know anything.
So now we
And it
say
doesn't have any intention of what it's saying to be interpreted in any way at all. It's just gonna say things,
Yes.
right?
But now you said all of this, and this is like the explanation of why like human intelligence is different from this, right? So how do we explain then the fact that people were demonstrated to be so incapable of actually understanding that what they were seeing was bullshit, right? Because what that kind of implies is that the model that the person has to do pattern recognition to like understand and like model the world, right, was reflected, like matched the bullshit, right? Like it's the same, right?
Well, because people do use pattern recognition, pattern matching, right? And so the problem is if you take a bullshit manufacturing system like a troll farm, or now like an AI troll farm, I guess, and you overwhelm people's inputs with bullshit, then the predominant source of information that they have has no relationship to the truth, right? So if you spend all your time on Facebook and all your quote news just comes from memes posted by your racist uncle or whatever, then over time you start to inhabit that world, right? Because that bullshit starts to crowd out your sample size of everything else.
Well, I think this is also
right.
I think this is also the distinction, like as we were talking about earlier, is that the way that your brain works is by a combination of modules that are all like interact with each other in complicated ways, right? That are capable of different kinds of things. And I think this way of sort of like, this is all metaphorical, right? It's not. People have historically always made the mistake of like whatever the tech they had available, they were like, oh, this is how human brains work, right? So
yeah, the brain is like a steam engine.
It's like a steam engine. And it was like, oh, well, it's got RAM and like a hard drive, just like our brains, like, and we keep on, but it's always metaphorical, right? But if we think about in this way where there's truth to the metaphor, just it's loose, right? Of us having like pattern recognition is a central component that our brains use to eventually determine models of the world that it's matching things against. In the same sort of vein, not the same way, but the same vein as what machine learning is doing, right? But there's also other things that our brains can do and do, right? But you don't have to, right? As in like there are lots of people who would search under the spotlight because that's the lit up spot. You know what I mean? Right? There are lots of people who just say things without actually having any understanding of what it means when they're saying those things, that are just a mishmash of the words that are like you listen to like any right-wing politician, right? And like that's what you're hearing is basically like this combination of terms. If you actually look into any one of them, it's like this doesn't mean anything actually, right? It's just recycling of these patterns, it's just the stochastic parroting, right?
Well, I think
it's about overwhelming with a message, right?
Well, no, I think it's about the fact that when you are reading something, when you are listening to someone, you are using a combination of tools to understand what's happening. So there's that joke about TED Talks, right? Which is like, if I want to give a TED Talk about absolutely the dumbest thing that you have ever heard of, if I change my cadence just like this, and then I tweak it this way, then suddenly I'm giving a TED Talk and you better listen to me because it sounds like I know what the fuck I'm talking about. Because what's happening is when you are reading a message from someone, actually there's a first step, which is just it's a coherency check that your brain's doing, which is just like, does this appear to make sense? I mean
pattern recognition. Yeah.
Yeah, not
it's the lowest level of pattern recognition.
Yeah, you don't have the bandwidth as a person to cross-check every fact, every piece of grammar someone has. So you get the gist oftentimes from other pieces of information, how well something's written, the kind of words is being used, the cadence of someone's speech, the tone or inflection, whatever. And the thing is, you can mimic all those other pieces way easier than you can mimic actual intelligence about something, right? Actual putting together of facts of something. And so it's not so much, I think, that it's like an overwhelming of the system with bullshit so much as it's a production of apparent coherence, which is the first read. And we don't have time. You never have had time. Like the default part of the brain that interprets this stuff. I believe this is true for my psych stuff, was that you default into belief because it's very expensive to default into disbelief about what people are saying to you, right? So it's
there's,
check
and there's-
facts
I would say
kind
it's
of
not
after
about
the fact.
defaulting into belief. It's having cheap heuristics, right? So
Yes,
which is
yes, yes.
heuristic is just a fancy word for pattern matching, right? It's just
shortcut to understand.
rule of thumb, right? And a rule
like,
of
this
thumb
is kinda like
is just
this,
pattern
so-
matching, right? Yeah, it's all the same. And so the point that I think is important here is that on the one hand, I agree completely that like machine learning is nothing like human learning. They're very different and so on, right? But I also do think that the efforts that people are making to draw distinctions between the two are the same kinds of things that people have always done, which is they default to the pattern that, well, human intelligence is unique in its own, like it's so amazing, it's its own kind of fancy thing, right? And when they talk about how they're different between like us and a certain kind of animal or whatever, right? They only capture it in like very certain terms actually, and where the stuff they talk about is representative of like they've picked out a certain subset of what people can do.
It's a
right?
spotlight again, basically.
Yeah, but not necessarily what people actually do, and not what all people actually do.
Because we do
and so
do
on.
this, right? And to
Yeah,
your
we
point,
absolutely do this. Like when people like when a seventh grader is writing an essay about a book they read,
Yeah.
right? Are they doing what, a person who's 35 and spent 20 years in academia studying the shit out of that thing? What's the difference between those two, right? Because one is like when I was in seventh grade, you could like take my essays and like any other fucking seventh grader's essays, and you could put them next to each other and be like, could have been generated by ChatGPT, right? Like I was, and like that's actually how we're taught. We're taught how to take patterns. Like it's like the 5-paragraph essay, and you start with the topic.
Well, yeah, an essay is not something that exists in nature, right? It's something that like somebody tells you exactly what an essay is and how to structure it and how to make one, and then for years you're just judged on how well you have
match the
executed on matching the pattern of what it's.
It's the
what's
same
expected.
way that machine learning is trained, where basically machines are given a whole bunch of examples, and then they're told, hey, generate new examples that look like this but aren't identical. And then we're going to score you on how close it was. And then if you do worse, then you tweak your model and you try again and it scores. It's grades, right? It's the same model, right? So yeah, like it's not how people work. And sure, like people have a whole bunch of advantages, right?
Well, it's just a part of.
But it's not just a part of it. It's like a really core.
It's a big part of it. Yeah.
It's a really core part. And I do believe that like the pattern matching aspect of that is actually so fundamentally a core part of what people do that as that stuff gets better, that like the reality of like how close this is to what we ask people to do in normal day-to-day life, whether it's hear a speech and determine if it sounds legit, right? Or whether it's sit down and like write something that somebody else needs to read, or whether it's process some information and like summarize it or whatever, right? Like that kind of stuff in the end is actually stochastic parroting.
Well, we're just working our way up through the developmental stages, right? Like we're building like toddler up to like 10-year-old child level of AIs that can just like see a thing and be like,
I mean, but only kind of, because it still doesn't understand what a hand is. You know what I mean? Like it's not its own.
But it does understand other things that humans would have a much harder time with, right? Like it doesn't understand, but it's able to do things.
Yeah, but the part where we're differentiating that like people are really trying to draw attention to is the idea of understanding, right? But that's not even something. Look, we don't actually understand what understanding is. You know what I mean? Like if you try to define that, it's real fucking slippery. It's like it starts to get away from you as you try to like really identify what that means, right? Because like what it really is the ability to like when we say like we understand something. What we mean is that we believe we have a cohesive model for that we can articulate that separates that thing from other things, right? Like that's kind of like what it means to understand.
But oftentimes when you think you understand something and then you try to explain it to somebody, you realize I have no fucking idea what I'm talking about.
all I want is for someone to train up an AI on the Elizabeth woman from Theranos, the blood drop company who committed a ton of fraud and got a bunch of investors to buy in for billions of dollars, and then just try it on some investor people and just see if it works. Because honestly,
see if they can raise some money.
Yeah, if you raise
but again, like this is happening, but people are doing this already. To like,
that's what I mean. It's the same.
Yeah,
like there is a model
the
like you're saying
entirety
about
of
TED
like
Talks, right?
Yeah, the entirety of the crypto boom, right? was just bullshit. It was the same stuff that like if you look at the stuff that people are saying, like, yeah, it sounds coherent. But again, if you start to dig into any one piece of it, you're like, wait a second, you know? And I think that's the
it's the same. Well, I think maybe this is
just the same stuff.
but
But the people who are saying that stuff, I think, sure, there are some people who are charlatans and like, as in like they're lying.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of people though who, like, as in the crypto space and everywhere else, right, who don't understand that they don't understand.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. But this is what I was trying to say, which is that I think that it's the case that in life, okay, in life there are two paths. My dog is screaming in the background. Don't worry about it. You can either basically focus into almost like specialize in pattern matching and basically stochastic regurgitation, like one of these AIs, right? And you do see this with people. You've met everyone has probably met a person who weirdly is that, right? Where they're saying things and then you start asking them questions and they cannot actually grapple with the things that they've said.
We call that the ideas guy.
Yeah. It's a thing, right? But you could actually make a full living off of these things, right? Depending on the industry you go into, depending on, again, you don't have to be a charlatan about it, but it can be the way that you navigate through the world.
Well, I think actually most of the world is that. Like almost any structure in the world that you start to look at, it's just bullshit cobbled together over time, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and
Bullshit cobbled together over time
is then the one of actually developing that understanding, right? It's an understanding model versus a pattern model, sort of a thing, and the differences they intersect with each other a lot, right? But I think depending on the person, depending on the situation, you maybe train up in more of a balance toward one or the other. But
I think that's true. Like that's the idea of like people have the capacity to like move towards let me actually like reason through this sort of side of things, right? But what we're actually actively trained to do is absolutely not that, right? Like going through our schooling systems and like the way that our family structures and social structures all work. It's all basically here's a pattern, fit the pattern. That's the whole thing, right? And you're actively pushed away from the understanding based model because, like, at least my experience as an autistic person, who like my default position is like, but why though, right? I need to build the explanation for why the model is the way that it is, right?
Yeah, and everybody's like, quit asking questions. We're on the clock here. We got to get through this.
They hate it. Yeah. And so like my experience as a person who didn't want to just like work with the pattern and move forward was that everybody hated it, and my peers would then try to prevent me from doing it, right? Because you're
wasting their time by asking questions.
Yeah, but I think the reasoning behind that is it's not the case that people hate it because they hate it.
No, I'm saying there's not reasoning behind it. I'm saying like that's how it all is set up, right? It's because every structure that we have in place basically discourages.
Yeah, but that's what we're getting at. It's like it's not like a natural propensity of people to hate like diving into things or having some questions.
It's how we've set everything up.
Yeah, in the case where you have structures that are pushing you on time and on like limited resources across every domain or whatever else, then explaining something and then getting beyond the point of where you think is sufficient to meet the standards that are coming up next week on the test or the fuck is not.
Yeah, that's my point though, is that I think because of the fact that that's how all of the pressures are aligned, right? Is that even though people do have the capacity to reason through stuff, right? In theory, in practice, it's pushed out of you the whole time, so that in the end, you basically like you're actually being constrained into being a stochastic parrot, right? And this is why, because like if you push most people on almost any belief that they have, you'll discover that they haven't actually thought about it, right? Like almost any, and that's not to say it's a good belief or a bad belief, just like.
Well, I think that the reality is you can always push further into any particular thing that a person.
Yeah, you always can. But the question is, what's the default degree to which you've pushed into it?
Yeah,
right?
What level of depth are you at?
And the default is actually like about 0 because that's what everything is pushing against. So I think this is where this all comes together and why AI that generates content, I think, is so fucking dangerous, and it's going to do a lot of really bad stuff, right? Because look what like 100 troll farmers were able to do, right? In 2016,
yeah,
right?
you can destabilize a whole democracy.
Yeah,
because that low level of effort.
Yeah, because people do not have. We're not actually living in a collection of structures that have enabled, but also like tried to make it so that people could dig, and that the default is actually digging, right?
Yeah.
Since we've been pushed away from that, then actually
very susceptible
the information that people generate is basically the same stuff, right? And that they like the patterns that they're dealing with are at the same level as what these AI content generation systems are already generating, right? So
Well, and there's another layer to human interpretation of things that currently isn't present in AI, which is the concept of defense mechanisms. Right.
Yep.
Where as a person, it has taken you a long time to get to this point in your life. You're invested.
You're also
right?
resistant to tweaking your patterns.
Yeah. And you also have a survival goal, right? Which is like we've talked in the past about the idea of the explore exploit paradigm, which is there is a time to sort of learn and do research, but you can't do that forever because at a certain point you run out of time or resources to just keep asking questions and like developing tools or tech or going to school or whatever. At some point, you got to actually take that education you got or take that knowledge you've got and use it to actually stay alive, right? Which is like go to school, get a job. That's the explore exploit model sort of summarized, right? And so so you have a purpose to learning all this stuff, which is survival, and there's a huge cost to learning all this stuff as well. Things that challenge all the investments you've made and all the steps you've taken to get up to this point are a threat to you. So at a certain point, your goal in life is no longer understanding and reasoning through to get to the truth. Your goal is to protect your investment, right? And so that means if you come across information online that says this thing that you like or that you've done or whatever is actually kind of a problem, and you should like eating meat, for example, is a good one, right? Where it's like, hey, this thing that we all, not all, but like many of us like to do, and it's like a core part of our life, and blah blah blah. Maybe we should think about maybe not doing that.
Scale it back a little bit.
Maybe we don't do that anymore. Yeah. And instead of just looking at that and going, that's some new information, I'm going to incorporate that into my life going forwards. Instead, it's I don't have time to like redo my whole freaking diet plan and figure out all these new recipes. And like, that's expensive. And I'm in survival mode now. Right. And it's like, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. And I'm also going to double down and rationalize. And in some cases, like become, the meat guy. Right. And like, and become very anti-vegetarian or anti-vegan.
Well, it's because
there's all these defense mechanisms.
But this is again like a pattern system because you have a mental model of yourself also, and like what it means to be a good person, what it means to be
exactly
right.
Yeah,
yeah, and all of your models become sort of entrenched, and also, because of the pressures also basically being like, well, if you do something bad, you're now a bad person, and then all the consequences of all of that.
Yeah, and I'm not a bad person. And if they're saying bad people eat meat and eating meat is bad, then they're clearly just wrong and dumb, right? Yeah. Because I'm good and I eat meat, and so doesn't jive.
I eat meat, still do.
Yeah, and I eat meat. I know the facts. I eat meat sometimes, but rarely, right?
Yeah, but the question is
just everywhere.
Yeah, but the question is do you do it belligerently or do you do it while admitting that there's an ethical dilemma that you're participating in, right?
Of course.
Yeah, I think that's the distinction, right? Is are you reactionary, right? Because you're like, oh, my pattern is being defied, right? And like I can't. That the pattern has to be true. I think true,
again,
right?
Going back to it's like the AI does not have an identity to defend because it doesn't know anything. It doesn't even know what it's saying. So the funny part about we were chatting with these things on character.ai was that they are very good at playing the improv game, the yes and.
Yeah.
They'll just take whatever you say and they're like, interesting. And then they just riff on it. Because again, one, it doesn't know what it's saying at all. And two, it has no identity to defend.
It has no self-preservation instincts.
Yeah, so
you could tell it something completely contrary to something that it has adamantly stated in very concretely stated in just the prior paragraph, and it will just do a complete 180 on its previous stance.
Yeah.
Which is honestly like.
And it depends on the model, right? Because you can create a model that hates certain ideas. Like, in terms of when it sees a pattern, what it generates is something that we would interpret as defensive, right? In response to it, you can absolutely create that, but that isn't the default state of the thing, right?
Which is very
but it is actually how, and I think that's the reason that there are so many people who are like warning about the consequences of all this is that because these things are stochastic parrots, right? And they have to be trained on data. then they will always reflect the data that goes in. And so if the data does a certain thing, then so will
Like a person.
just like a person, then so will the output, right? And so and you see this with like ChatGPT, like a lot of what you see is like they make a release and then you see a whole bunch of news items about, oh, it turns out if you put in like if you ask it questions about like X, you can get it to say something bad, right? And then they put out a patch, and then the next day, like you can't make that happen anymore, right? And you'll see things like what was it? There was I can't remember which of the things it was a little while ago, but there was some image generator that would like it just like wouldn't generate. It would only generate like white people with some certain query that you would ask, right? And then somebody discovered that once they like patched it out, what they actually had done was like anytime the word like person or something was put in there, they would actually automatically amend the query that came out, and they would actually append like all different like ethnicities and stuff like to the end of the query so that it would actually generate, right? And that's actually what has to happen.
So basically what they're saying is by default, our system is person is white person. And you have to then in our trained data set, and then to get people of any other race, you have to specifically go outside of the bounds of our default data.
Yeah, but this is actually how all data sets work, right? Because the data set reflects the biases and the structural biases of the system that the data came from. And if you don't actively work against that, then all you do is you just make things that are really good at generating information that looks like the information that data set would contain, right?
But there's also
if it's super biased data, then so is the output.
But there's also kind of bizarre guardrails that end up getting put on these that go in some cases beyond this, like beyond the scope of reason. So like one of the things that you'll see in ChatGPT is if you ever ask it anything about like what somebody looks like or something like that, it will never tell you, it will never say any comment about it. Yeah. Even something like, and I think this is still true, but if you ask it something like, what will be the gender of the first female president of the United States? And it will be like, there's no way to know that. or what would be the religion of a Jewish CEO of a company? And they'll be like, I can't comment on that. There's just simply no way to know. And we shouldn't judge people based on that, right? Right. And it's like, so there's all these programmed responses in there where it'll look for questions about, or look for like, you know, phrases or words about appearance or race or
hot topic bounds. That are
and it just won't comment on it, even if it's just a factual basic, like, is A equal to A?
Because it doesn't know what that you're saying.
Because it doesn't know what you're saying. Yeah. So it's just a dumb robot, right?
Well, and it always will be missing any nuance because you can't generate nuance from an enormous statistical sample, right? And where the idea is to identify patterns and then use those patterns to generate stuff that looks. And this again, hands are nuanced. That's why you can't make them. If you want to have a discussion about the politics and complexity of like gender and like and related concepts, right? Like
robot is not the conversational partner.
That is not the conversational partner for that because it can only do
there's not a lot of data about that.
Well, and even when there is, it can only reflect the most dominant patterns, right? Which then cannot be the nuanced ones. It cannot be the ones that talk about how like, oh, it's actually an interesting question about, because like the question of whether like the first female president, what gender are they, right, is actually a very nuanced question because gender and biology are not the same, right? But it can't give you that answer because that's not going to be found in that like data set of basically random fucking articles.
And importantly, that's not a question that any person would ask unless they were trying to test a robot to see what it would say in response, right? Because like to ask, you know, for what's the gender of somebody who identifies as insert gender here, right? And it's like, why would you ask that question? You know the answer already, right? The answer's in the question. So why would the data set include any kind of exchange that looks like that, you know? So like you said, there's no nuance. There's no possibility for nuance there.
And if you treat these things like they have nuance or the ability to give you answers about things that it doesn't have in its data set, because it'll still unless it's been programmed to not do it, right? Then it will still it'll still spit out something, you know?
Oh yeah,
but it'll still do it.
Some spidery hand. I think to me it's just the hand is the thing, because it's like, would you trust someone giving you answers who, when you first ask them the question of how many fingers does a hand have, they give you a bunch of different responses that are all over the map, And maybe a few of them are correct, 5, but then they're also like, sometimes hands have 7 fingers. Sometimes there's another hand coming out of a hand. And then would you ask them a question that you want a fucking answer to, a real answer to, about how to market your product?
Yeah.
No, good God, no. It's so obvious. So don't think about
Now,
it.
something that I will say, it just has like a final closing kind of interesting activity for our listeners to try is just go over to character.ai. This is a website where basically people have put together through like very basic priming a collection of different AI characters that you can talk to. One of them is a game designer bot, which Sam and I were playing around with a while ago. And it was very fascinating because, like Sam was saying, it's an improv partner where it will yes and sort of anything that you do. So you can say like, yeah, I want to make a game with like this is the core mechanic, and then the bot will come back and be like, oh, that's really cool. Like, have you thought about maybe like working in this additional concept into it, or like it actually like feeds you ideas? But again, it's based on patterns of like stuff that it has seen.
So you can't just take it and run.
Yeah, it doesn't. So it doesn't know what it's saying, but it's an interesting like I think where these things are useful is when it comes to having someone quote in quotes to bounce ideas off of and have like a conversational partner about something like fiction, right? Which is like you're designing a game and you want to like invent some kind of a new kind of an animal in your game or whatever, right? And like. One of the weirdest things was when I was talking with this game designer bot, and I was just like making shit up just to see like what it would say, and I'm like, oh yeah, like I want to make I'm making a game where like you can acquire or you can like develop the capabilities of different kinds of animals, right? What would be some interesting ideas for things that the player could do by learning from different animals, right? And the AI said that one of the mechanics could be that you can develop snail eyes, which you could use to look around corners. And I was like, that's fucking brilliant. And so every now and then and even if what it says is nonsense, sometimes it will oftentimes plant the seed of an idea where you're like, ooh, actually though, like that's dumb as hell. But like if I take that in a different direction. Yeah. But you don't have to worry about your design partner, conversational partner having their own agenda or getting hung up on something. And like the AI can say something and you can just go, no, that's too dumb. Let's try something else. And the AI would be like, okay. And then it just moves on, right? Because it has no opinions about trying to protect its own
It's useful for ideation that you intend to check and do research on later. That is the extent of it. That's all I would use.
Trust nothing.
Trust nothing about
good for riffing,
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, that's why it's also like I mean, so on like the programming side, GitHub Copilot just keeps getting better. Like it's getting really good these days at helping me do my programming job. And again, it's the same idea. It's like it's because of places where patterns that aren't nuanced actually, right, are really useful are things like programming, right? It's like I've seen literally 10 billion for loops, and so if I sit down and I've done something that's like almost always ends up having a for loop following it, right? There's a good chance that's what I'm doing too, like a really good chance that that's what's happening.
Programming is not hands.
It's not hands.
It's not hands. It's the whole
more like
thing
faces.
actually about programming. Yeah, it's even better than faces, I think. It's like because the whole point is you have to tell the computer exactly what to do. That's the most beautiful space I think for one of these stochastic parrots to operate in. Yeah. Beautiful space.
Because the semantics and the data are the same, actually. Right?
Yes.
There's not an extra a layer that isn't in the data, right?
Yeah, it's what you're doing looks like this. You're probably going to do this other thing next because that's just what happens.
Because what it looks
most
like
of the time.
what it looks like is what it means. And I think that's the crux of it.
Good
right?
space for it.
Yeah, that's also why like ChatGPT can do such a good job because human language isn't as
it's not random.
It's not as reliable as that, right? But it's not random either. It is, but again, it's like that really biased randomness, right? Yeah. And again, the data and the semantic and the data and the meaning are almost in perfect alignment in the same way that programming is, just not quite, right? It's a lot looser. But unlike image data, which is like it's a 2-dimensional set of colors, right? And then we're trying to be like, is there a face in here, right? Like the meaning and the data are really decoupled in the case of image analysis.
Very different.
Yeah. Yes, that's true. Yeah, with words, it's like some words have a tendency to come after some other words.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the whole model pretty much. So, all right. Well, anyway, I mean, we could riff on AI like all day. So we'll probably do it more next week, because there's always weird stuff happening with this. But that's all the time we have for this week. We'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Sampa DaCosta, for putting the podcast together. And thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the archives. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Goodbye.